By late 1942, the desperate struggle known as the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching a terrifying climax. German U-boats were sinking Allied supply ships at an alarming and unsustainable rate, directly threatening to sever Britain's vital lifeline of food, oil, and material, which in turn risked starving the nation into submission. A key strategic weakness for the Allies was the German control over several deep-water ports along the coast of occupied France. Specifically, the port of Bordeaux was of massive importance to the German war effort. Located far inland, approximately 100 miles up the Gironde River, it was being used to safely harbor valuable German blockade runners and large supply ships. These ships were too critical and too well defended by coastal batteries, anti-submarine nets, and continuous river patrols for any conventional attack by Allied aircraft or larger naval vessels. To inflict damage here, Allied command needed a solution that was not merely unconventional, but practically invisible. Into this strategic challenge stepped a brilliant and audacious mind, Major Herbert Blondie Hassler of the Royal Marines. Hassler was an expert in small boat tactics, a formidable navigator, and an officer who believed that technology and courage could overcome brute force. He proposed a radical and seemingly suicidal plan that would bypass all the heavy defenses and enemy surveillance. His core idea was to utilize the smallest, most silent craft imaginable, the two-man folding canoes, known informally by the commandos as Cockleshells. The mission was to be launched from a submarine, and the tiny flotilla would then navigate the treacherous, freezing river environment over several nights to reach the heavily guarded harbor. Hassler convinced his superiors that the sheer absurdity of the plan was its greatest defense. The Germans would never expect an attack to come from inside the river network itself. This incredible and improbable mission was officially codenamed Operation Frankton. The unit selected to carry it out was the newly formed Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment, a tiny, elite group of just 10 hand-picked volunteers from the Royal Marines. Every volunteer was selected not just for his physical strength, but for exceptional self-reliance, high intelligence, and the ability to maintain absolute composure under extreme duress. Their training was intense, focusing on silent paddling techniques, grueling endurance, and specialized instruction in the placement of limpet mines, magnetic explosives designed to stick to and sink a ship's hull. The men had to master complex navigation by star and compass on fast-moving water, all while avoiding the deadly minefields and patrolling German vessels they were certain to encounter along the river route. The plan detailed that 5 of these folding canoes would be launched from the submarine far out in the Bay of Biscay. The commandos would then have to paddle the agonizing 100 miles up the freezing Gironde River, plant their mines on the ships within Bordeaux harbor, and, after completing the demolition, the men would scuttle their canoes and split into 2-man teams. Their final and most dangerous phase was a grueling overland escape on foot, a journey of hundreds of miles through occupied France to reach the neutral safety of Spain. The odds of success were deemed minuscule, with survival statistically improbable. Yet, the strategic importance of disrupting the German supply chain, particularly before the Allied push in North Africa, was deemed worth the risk, and the courage of the 10 volunteers was matched only by the desperate need for a victory. The mission was set for December 1942, right in the freezing heart of winter, a final element adding to the extraordinary danger. The mission began on the frigid night of December 7, 1942, deep in the churning, unpredictable waters of the Bay of Biscay. The Royal Navy submarine HMS Tuna had successfully navigated the dangerous route to the designated drop zone, approximately 8 miles off the mouth of the powerful Gironde River. As the submarine surfaced under the cover of darkness, the 10 commandos of the Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment scrambled onto the deck to assemble their fragile craft. The men, led by Major Herbert Blondie Hassler, worked quickly against a backdrop of rough, freezing waves, transferring the collapsible 5 two-man folding canoes, their weapons, and the deadly limpet mines from the submarine's cramped interior onto the deck. The extreme difficulty and immediate danger of this initial phase were instantly evident, as the sea was much rougher than anticipated, with waves crashing over the exposed men and their tiny vessels. The first disaster struck before the canoes were even fully launched and away from the submarine. As the men struggled to secure the equipment and prepare for the sea in the heavy swell, the fragile canvas hull of one canoe, codenamed Cuttlefish, was severely damaged by the relentless waves smashing it against the submarine's massive hull. The canoe was deemed immediately irreparable in the darkness and freezing conditions, forcing its 2 highly trained crewmen to be regretfully taken back aboard the submarine. Moments later, a second canoe, Commodore, flipped completely over in the rough sea shortly after launch, capsizing its occupants. Despite the heroic efforts of the Royal Marines crew on the HMS Tuna to rescue the men, the 2 occupants of Commodore were tragically lost to the freezing waters and powerful currents of the Atlantic. In the span of a few harrowing minutes, the striking force was brutally reduced from 10 men in 5 canoes to just 6 men in 3 canoes. Canoe Catfish, Major Hassler and Marine Bill Sparks; Canoe Crayfish, Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills; and Canoe Coalfish, Sergeant Samuel Davis and Marine Frederick Ewart. Despite the shocking immediate losses, Major Hassler made the agonizing decision to continue the mission. The remaining 3 canoes proceeded stoically toward the mouth of the Gironde River, their mission parameters now exponentially more difficult and dangerous due to their reduced numbers, and the profound psychological toll of losing comrades so early. The river itself, one of France's largest, presented a series of immense, unseen threats. The commandos were immediately subjected to freezing temperatures, powerful and erratic tidal currents, and swirling whirlpools in the estuary. The freezing water constantly sloshed over the sides of the tiny, low-riding canoes, forcing the men to paddle relentlessly just to maintain control and direction, all while desperately trying to remain silent and invisible in the vast, open expanse of the estuary, which was constantly patrolled by German vessels. The true challenge of navigation and survival began when the canoes entered the estuary and started their long journey upriver. To avoid inevitable detection by German sentries and patrol boats, the Royal Marines had to paddle almost exclusively at night, often battling the strong ebb tide that threatened to push their small craft back out to the Atlantic. During the day, they faced the near impossible task of finding adequate camouflage along the desolate, flat, and heavily monitored banks of the river. They were often forced to bury their canoes completely under mud and vegetation, or hide themselves in dense, freezing thickets of bushes, suffering tremendously from exposure and the biting cold. The sheer physical output required to paddle against the relentless current while managing the intense cold, the crippling lack of sleep, and the constant fear of discovery was tremendous. Every single mile gained was a testament to their grueling training and superhuman determination, knowing that the ultimate objective, the heavily guarded Bordeaux harbor, lay at least 4 more nights of exhausting, silent paddling upriver through hostile territory. The grueling reality of Operation Frankton settled into a punishing routine for the 6 remaining commandos of the Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment. Each night was a relentless cycle of silent, synchronized paddling against the powerful incoming tide of the Gironde River. The men, freezing cold and soaked to the bone from the constant spray and the low-riding nature of their canoes, pushed their endurance to the absolute limit. They moved with only their senses, relying on Major Herbert, Blondie, Hassler's exceptional navigation, and the faint outlines of the riverbanks. The canoes had to hug the shadows, staying close to the shore to avoid the main current and, more importantly, to evade the detection of German armed patrol boats which traversed the center of the river, their powerful engines roaring and their searchlights occasionally sweeping the surface. The river was their primary path, but also their constant, overwhelming threat, demanding absolute silence even as they passed near small French villages. The daytime hideouts were almost as torturous as the nightly paddling. The small, desolate banks of the Gironde River offered minimal cover, forcing the commandos to rely on meticulous camouflage. They learned to quickly drag the three canoes, catfish, crayfish, and coalfish, into thickets of freezing bushes or bury them beneath the muddy banks, then cover them with leaves and debris. The men themselves had to remain absolutely motionless, often lying in freezing, wet conditions for up to 15 hours. The physical ordeal was compounded by the intense psychological strain of constant fear. They were acutely aware that any passing German soldier or even a curious local French fisherman could discover their hiding place, leading to instant capture and summary execution. They had to sustain themselves on the minimal rations they carried, which offered barely enough energy for the exhausting nightly paddle. However, the relentless river conditions soon claimed another victim. After 3 nights of brutal paddling, as the canoes approached the halfway point of their journey, disaster struck the third remaining craft. Canoe Coalfish, containing Sergeant Samuel Davis and Marine Frederick Ewart, was swept away by a vicious tidal current while attempting to pass a German-controlled navigational lock or sluice gate. In the darkness, the small boat vanished without a trace, separated irrevocably from the others. Despite frantic, whispered attempts to make contact, Major Hassler and the remaining 2 canoes were forced to continue, having lost 2 more invaluable members and a significant portion of their already diminished explosive payload. Now, only 4 men in 2 canoes remained, catfish and crayfish, still pushing forward on a mission that had already cost 6 lives. With the loss of Coalfish, the remaining 4 men knew the mission was entering its final, most dangerous phase. The area surrounding Bordeaux was becoming more densely populated and heavily fortified, with increased river traffic and more frequent German patrols. They were no longer simply navigating. They were penetrating a major enemy logistical hub. Hassler's primary objective shifted to conservation of energy and extreme vigilance. They realized the time for stealth was running out, and that the element of surprise was the only remaining weapon. The 2 small canoes, carrying the last remaining hopes of Operation Frankton, pushed into the final stretch of the river, preparing for the audacious, close-quarters attack on the German blockade runners that lay waiting inside the heavily guarded docks. Every stroke of the paddle now carried the weight of the entire Atlantic campaign. After 4 nights of punishing, relentless paddling, the 2 surviving canoes, Catfish, led by Major Herbert, Blondie, Hassler, and Crayfish, manned by Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills, were nearing the final objective. The river was now narrower, and the tidal currents were even more fierce, but the most pressing threat was the sheer volume of military traffic and the permanent shore defenses. They successfully slipped past the heavily fortified naval bases at the mouth of the Gironde River and numerous German patrol boats, relying entirely on the shadows and the muffled sound of their paddles. Physical exhaustion was total. The 4 remaining Royal Marines were gaunt, soaked, and suffering severely from the continuous exposure to the December cold and the psychological toll of losing half their team. Yet, the proximity of the enemy city of Bordeaux fueled their final effort, and the glow of the city lights in the distance was a grim, exhilarating signal that the point of no return had finally been reached. On the night of December 11, 1942, the commandos reached a final, pre-planned daytime hiding spot, an isolated marsh area just a few miles below the docks of Bordeaux. This was their last chance to rest and finalize the attack plans while completely concealed. They meticulously hid their 2 canoes and themselves for the entire day, knowing the city was crawling with German forces and the coastal area was under tight surveillance. Major Herbert Hassler reviewed the most recent intelligence, noting the high value of the German blockade runners and supply ships currently in port, and expertly adapted the mission parameters. Originally intended for 5 teams, the reduced number of canoes meant they had to prioritize targets and split up immediately after planting the mines. The risk of detection was now at its absolute peak, as their targets were no longer isolated river convoys but massive, stationary ships within a heavily secured, man-made harbor. The final, audacious phase of Operation Frankton demanded split-second execution and nerves of steel. That night, the 2 canoes paddled the last few miles, separating as they entered the terrifying, dense chaos of the dockyards. Canoe catfish focused on the western side of the harbor, while canoe crayfish moved to the eastern docks. The commandos navigated silently past the huge, dark silhouettes of German and Italian ships, the docks teeming with sentries, roving patrols, and watchdogs. They had to attach the specialized limpet mines beneath the waterline of their chosen targets, activate the crucial 9-hour fuses, and retreat before any mine detonated. It was a harrowing race against the clock and an exercise in pure, absolute stealth, operating in the most heavily defended enemy harbor in occupied France, knowing that if they were caught, they would face immediate execution under Hitler's notorious Commando Order. After successfully placing their mines on several high-value enemy ships, the 2 canoe teams met briefly at a small, pre-arranged rendezvous point just outside the immediate harbor area. There were no emotional farewells, only a quick, professional confirmation of mission success. Having completed the demolition phase, their purpose as naval commandos was over. They scuttled their fragile folding canoes, sinking them permanently to destroy all evidence of their method of entry. Wet, freezing, and carrying only light packs and escape kits, the 4 remaining Royal Marines faced the truly daunting prospect of their 900-mile journey on foot across occupied France to the neutral border of Spain. The most dangerous phase of the mission, the battle for survival and freedom, had just begun. Hours after Major Herbert, Blondie, Hassler and his team melted away from the Bordeaux harbor, the dramatic consequence of their 4 nights of grueling effort erupted. The limpet mines, set to their long fuses, detonated just before dawn, rocking the heavily secured port. Several high-value German and Italian supply ships and blockade runners were seriously damaged or sunk, causing immediate chaos and immense logistical disruption. The German command was left stunned and furious. Their supposedly impregnable port, located deep within occupied France, had been successfully penetrated by an unseen enemy. Initial German searches immediately focused on air and sea, but it soon became terrifyingly clear to them that the attackers had arrived silently from the river. A massive manhunt was swiftly launched across the region, targeting any suspicious persons or small boats, and the entire French region was harshly placed under martial law. The 4 remaining Royal Marines commandos had successfully escaped the immediate harbor area before the dramatic explosions. After scuttling their canoes, the men quickly changed into civilian clothes, dark, worn garments that offered minimal disguise, but were absolutely essential for their infiltration and escape on land. The 2 teams, Major Herbert Hassler with Marine Bill Sparks and Corporal Albert Laver with Marine William Mills, separated as planned, each carrying only a pistol, minimal rations, and a few thousand francs. They navigated only at night, following secondary roads, smaller rivers, and railway lines away from the main German checkpoints, heading east toward the river Gironde before beginning their long, arduous journey south across the vast territory of occupied France toward the Pyrenees Mountains and the neutral border of Spain. Tragedy struck the second team swiftly and brutally. Due to extreme physical exhaustion, continuous exposure, and the urgent need to find proper shelter, Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills were captured only 2 days into their overland escape near the town of La Réole. They were quickly interrogated by the German security service, who soon understood they were British commandos involved in the Bordeaux sabotage. Under direct order from Adolf Hitler's infamous Commando Order, which explicitly decreed that all commandos caught behind German lines were to be executed immediately without trial, Corporal Laver and Marine Nils were brutally murdered by a German firing squad shortly after their capture. Their sacrifice was immense, a direct result of their absolute commitment to the mission, and their deaths would become a tragic symbol of the ruthless fate awaiting any captured Special Forces operative in the European theater. The other two men, Major Herbert Hassler and Marine Bill Sparks, were unaware of their comrades' tragic fate, but their own journey was no less perilous. They continued their arduous overland trek, relying entirely on their discipline and training to evade countless German patrols. Their survival hinged entirely on remaining invisible and occasionally receiving aid from brave, patriotic members of the French resistance, or the general public, who risked their own lives to provide safe houses, food, and directional assistance. The knowledge that they were operating under the shadow of the Commando Order, a fact later confirmed to the Allies after the war, underscored the impossible stakes of their mission. Every mile walked and every night survived was a victory, not just against the environment, but against the Nazi regime's specific decree of summary execution. After the initial few days of pure adrenaline, the overland escape settled into a grueling, month-long agony for Major Herbert, Blondie, Hassler, and Marine Bill Sparks. Their ultimate destination was the neutral territory of Spain, a journey requiring them to traverse hundreds of miles of frozen, hostile terrain during the depths of the French winter. Their exhaustion was absolute. Their feet were covered in blisters, their clothes thin and wet, and their energy reserves were constantly depleted by hunger and the freezing temperatures. They had adopted a simple, though flimsy, cover story. They were shipwrecked fishermen trying to walk home. They traveled only at night, hiding in barns, woods, or under bridges during the day, desperately trying to conserve the energy needed to keep moving south toward their crucial rendezvous point near the town of Ruffick. The survival of the two Royal Marines hinged entirely on the immense bravery of the French people and the organized network of the French resistance. Every few days, they would risk contact with locals, relying on a prearranged phrase or a subtle sign to identify friendly faces. They were passed along a dedicated escape line by passeurs, smugglers, and resistance fighters, who provided them with food, temporary shelter, and, crucially, guidance around heavily guarded German checkpoints. The trust involved was total and terrifying. Any collaborator or informer could have doomed them instantly, leading to capture and the guaranteed execution dictated by the Commando Order. Their every meal and safe night's sleep was a priceless gift paid for by the immense risk taken by their patriotic French helpers. Despite the invaluable aid, the journey remained fraught with peril. They had to navigate areas controlled by the collaborationist Vichy France police, who often worked directly with the German Gestapo to root out foreign agents and resistance members. Near misses with German military patrols became a terrifying, regular occurrence, particularly when the commandos were forced to cross major roads, bridges, or railway lines under the cover of darkness. They moved through areas where German troop concentrations were high, constantly hearing the rumble of military convoys and the shouts of soldiers. The psychological strain of maintaining their facade while being desperately ill, knowing that the slightest suspicion would lead to immediate interrogation and death, was immense. The long, arduous journey continued deep into January 1943. Their bodies were at the breaking point, but the success of their mission, the knowledge that German ships were sunk or damaged in Bordeaux, drove them forward. They were finally approaching the final, most difficult barrier, the demarcation line that separated occupied France from the nominally free Vichy zone, and then the massive barrier of the Pyrenees Mountains leading to Spain. They had been walking for over a month, surviving on sheer resilience and the kindness of strangers. The next phase required them to locate the specific smugglers who could guide them across the mountains and into neutral territory, the final, desperate challenge of Operation Frankton. By late January 1943, after nearly 7 weeks of continuous evasion, Major Herbert, Blondie, Hassler, and Marine Bill Sparks reached the final, critical barrier in their escape, the demarcation line. This heavily policed border separated German-occupied France from the puppet state of Vichy France. Crossing the line was an immensely dangerous maneuver, as it was patrolled by both German Gestapo agents and Vichy border police, all under strict orders to capture or kill any suspected Allied agents. Utilizing the last contact in their escape network, Hassler and Sparks were guided to a secluded crossing point under the cover of a freezing night, silently slipping through barbed wire and past searchlights. They successfully made it into the Vichy zone, but the relief was only fleeting, as their ultimate destination remained hundreds of miles away, the towering, frozen barrier of the Pyrenees Mountains. Their escape route then led them south into the forbidding foothills of the colossal mountain range. Here, they met the specialized passeurs, smugglers, and expert mountain guides who knew the treacherous, often snowbound paths into Spain. The physical ordeal of climbing the Pyrenees in the heart of winter was arguably the most extreme hardship they had faced. The freezing temperatures, deep snow, treacherous ice, and thin air were a massive shock to their bodies, already pushed to the brink by weeks of starvation and lack of sleep. They had to discard much of their remaining gear to cope with the altitude and the need for vertical climbing. The risk of death from exposure or a simple fall on the icy slopes became a greater, constant threat than direct German capture. The actual mountain crossing took several agonizing days, each step fraught with peril. The paths were not only technically difficult, but were frequently monitored by both German patrols on the French side and Spanish border guards on the neutral side. The final, triumphant moment came as the two Royal Marines, Major Herbert Hassler and Marine Bill Sparks, finally staggered across the unmarked border and onto Spanish soil. Their immediate goal was reached, but their immediate peril was not over. Though officially neutral, the fascist regime of General Franco in Spain was sympathetic to the Axis powers. They risked immediate arrest and internment, or worse, being handed over to the pursuing German Gestapo agents, who often operated near the border towns. Fortunately, the established escape line was fully prepared and waiting. Shortly after crossing into Spain, Hassler and Sparks were quickly linked up with members of the massive, organized underground British and French network. They were treated, clothed, and safely moved across Spain under the protection of the Secret Service, a testament to the incredible infrastructure of the escape lines. Their long journey finally ended when they were transported from Spain to the safety of the British base at Gibraltar. From there, they returned to Britain in early 1943, nearly 2 months after their launch. The ultimate victory was not just their survival, but the fact that Major Herbert Hassler could personally report to the Admiralty that Operation Frankton had been a decisive strategic success. Major Herbert, Blondie, Hassler, and Marine Bill Sparks were the only 2 men of the original 10 who returned to Britain from Operation Frankton. Their safe return in early 1943 was a massive morale boost and, more importantly, a crucial strategic victory. Hassler's immediate, detailed report confirmed that the raid on Bordeaux harbor had been an undeniable success. Several German and Italian supply ships had been significantly damaged or sunk by the limpet mines. The total disruption to the German supply lines on the Atlantic coast was substantial, contributing directly to the relief felt during the Battle of the Atlantic. The sheer daring of the attack was highly praised by military leaders, with General Bernard Montgomery reportedly stating that the raid shortened the war by 6 months. However, the victory was paid for with a heavy, tragic price. Although Hassler and Sparks survived their grueling ordeal, the mission resulted in a catastrophic loss of life for their comrades. As noted previously, Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills were captured and executed immediately by the Germans under the illegal Commando Order. Furthermore, the two men from the canoe Coalfish, Sergeant Samuel Davis and Marine Frederick Ewart, who were separated and later captured, also faced the same brutal fate. Even more tragically, the crew of the fifth canoe, whose craft was damaged and forced to return to the submarine, but who were later captured after subsequent commando raids, were also executed, bringing the total number of commandos murdered after capture to 8. Only Hassler and Sparks escaped the Nazi decree. The aftermath of Operation Frankton brought the full barbarity of the Commando Order to the forefront of Allied awareness. The fact that all captured commandos were murdered rather than treated as prisoners of war galvanized the Allies, and underscored the truly brutal and criminal nature of the enemy command. The 10 brave men of the Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment became immortalized as the Cockleshell Heroes. Major Herbert Hassler was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and Marine Bill Sparks received the Distinguished Service Medal for their extraordinary bravery. But their actions represented the highest form of courage and self-sacrifice displayed by all 10 men. The legacy of Operation Frankton is profound and enduring. It proved the immense potential of small, highly specialized units operating with deep stealth and unconventional tactics, directly influencing the planning and training of virtually every modern Special Forces unit. The sheer audacity of the raid, paddling 100 miles up a heavily guarded river to sink ships in a secured port, captured the imagination of the public and the military. The story of the Cockleshell Heroes remains an enduring testament to the ingenuity and unwavering resolve of the Royal Marines and the sacrifices made by those who risked everything to strike at the heart of the enemy, securing their mission as one of the most famous small unit raids in all of World War II.